For management access to configure the firewall, we use 4 different protocols. We can connect to the firewall and configure the firewall in 4 different ways. To configure authentication for each connection method, we use the command AAA authentication. Let's have a look at what options we have here. We have 4 protocols that can be used to communicate with the firewall for management purposes. We have HTTP. HTTP means that we are running the GUI, the graphical user interface, called ASDM, Adaptive Security Device Manager. So when we run the GUI to configure the firewall, we run ASDM and then it uses HTTP, or actually HTTPS because it's encrypted, to communicate between the ASDM client and the firewall. That is configured as HTTP in the ASA. So when we see the option HTTP for the command AAA authentication, we need to know that that is ASDM. We can use ASDM to communicate with the firewall. We can also use serial. Serial is the console port, and we can connect to the firewall console port with a serial cable. And to set up how to authenticate users connecting that way, we use AAA authentication serial. This option is rarely being used because normally when you connect to the serial port, you have physical access to the device and you don't need to have any further authentication except for the enable password. So you normally do not set up any AAA authentication serial. Next method is SSH. SSH is an encrypted command line interface session. We connect to the firewall to its IP address using an SSH client, and the communication method is encrypted and authenticated. And we have the opposite for SSH, it's a telnet. Telnet is the last way to communicate with the firewall for management purposes. We normally recommend not to use telnet because it's clear text. It means that anyone in the middle of the traffic flow can see everything that happens in the telnet session. We recommend not to use telnet, but use SSH instead. We have HTTP, we have serial, which is the console, we have SSH, and we have telnet. For each method, we define with the command AAA authentication how to authenticate the connection. For example, if we need to tell how to authenticate users connecting with ASDM, we use the command AAA authentication HTTP, and after that we have the keyword console. And console does not mean serial port, it's always the word console here. We have AA authentication HTTP console, and after that an authentication method. The only existing default authentication method is local with capital letters. That means that we use the local username and password configured in the firewall. If we use anything else except for local, we need to define radius or TACACS connection to a remote server. And to do that, we put the username and passwords in an external database, for example, Active Directory. But in this case, we used authentication method local for HTTP connections, which means that everyone that connects with ASM to the firewall will be authenticated using the local username and password. Vice versa, we can use the same for SSH console, and we write local here to say that we use the local database for authentication for SSH sessions, and we use the same for telnet if we want to do that. One thing to mention about telnet connection is that you can never allow telnet access from outside interface. You cannot ever connect to the firewall using telnet on the interface with the lowest security level of the device. That's a built-in limitation to prevent anyone administrating the firewall to allow unencrypted telnet access to the internet-facing interface of the firewall. I recommend you to not use telnet at all. But if you do, you cannot use it on outside, and that's good. If you want to set up authentication method for the console port, you use a serial console and local here as well in the configuration. If we look at the current configuration in this device, we have set up local authentication for SSH and for HTTP. But we have one strange command in the middle here. It says AAA authentication enable console local. That's really strange. That means that for enable purposes, if I enter enable here and press enter, I'm asked for enable password. By default in the firewall, there is a global enable password. In the firewall, in the configuration, you normally can set a enable password, and something like that. By default, you use that password when doing the enable command, no matter which user you are logging into the firewall. However, if you enter this command in the firewall, AAA authentication enable console local, that means that whenever a user enters enable, he will enter his own password as enable password down here, and not by default the global enable password. If we do not have this command in the configuration and we press enable to log into the device, we will use the global enable password configuring the firewall. Normally, I recommend you to add this command because the user uses his own password once again to get into the firewall. It all depends on how granular access you need to have in the firewall. If you have ever any user connecting to the firewall without global fully rights or enable 15, you should not have this command. But in most cases, all users that are created in the firewall should have enable access anyway. So you can add this command because it makes life easier because every user uses his own password again to log in to do the enable. This is a bit strange command. I recommend it. We have learned how to configure the firewall to authenticating user connecting for management access, how to make sure that the correct users are being logged in and no one else.